You weren't just a mother making spaghetti on a Tuesday night, stirring sauce while your kids colored at the kitchen table. You were Lieutenant Hawk, though no one in that warm kitchen knew it yet. That's the thing about stories like this. They don't always begin with battlefields or medals pinned to uniforms. Sometimes, they begin with crayons and laughter, with bread rising in the oven, with the hum of a life so ordinary it hides the extraordinary. And then the phone lit up. Two words changed everything: deployment alert. Before we go deeper, let me ask you this. If you agree that real courage isn't measured by age or gender, but by sacrifice, then like and subscribe, because this story deserves to be remembered. She was in her late 20s, steady hands guiding the wooden spoon across the pot. But when the screen glowed and those words appeared, her fingers trembled for just a moment. Only a moment, before she reached for the phone. Her children, a boy of 7 and a girl just 5, barely noticed at first, too wrapped up in coloring, their crayons scattered across the kitchen table. But she noticed. The way the room seemed to hold its breath. The way the quiet suddenly pressed against her chest like a weight. She placed the spoon down carefully, wiped her hands on the apron still dusted with flour, and knelt beside them. The boy looked up first, curious. The girl followed, her eyes searching her mother's face, sensing what words hadn't yet been spoken. There are things young children understand without needing to be told, and this was one of them. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, when she said, "Mommy has to go." The boy frowned. The girl clutched the crayon tighter. Outside the kitchen window, the world rolled on without pause. Neighbors pulling cars into driveways, porch lights flicking on, unaware that inside one house, history had quietly shifted. She had lived this moment before, though never with children watching. At 19, she had stood in a different kitchen, her mother's kitchen, announcing that she had enlisted, that she wanted to serve, that she believed she had more to give than a safe, small life. Back then, there were tears, arguments, accusations. "You're too young. You're a girl. You'll regret this." She didn't regret it. She became Hawk because she never missed a thing, because she saw from angles others overlooked, because in the chaos of combat she remained steady, sharp, unflinching. But none of that mattered here, not to the two pairs of eyes looking up at her now. To them, she wasn't Lieutenant Hawk. She was just Mom, the one who braided hair and checked homework and kissed scraped knees. She reached for her dog tags, always hanging just out of sight beneath her shirt, and let them slip into view. Her son's eyes widened. Her daughter reached for them with both hands. They had never meant much to anyone outside the service, just cold metal stamped with numbers. But in that moment, in the glow of the kitchen light, they became a promise. A promise that she would come back, no matter how far she went, no matter what she faced. She pressed the tags into their little hands and whispered, "These are yours until I return. They'll keep us connected." The oven timer beeped. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. Life insisted on carrying on, oblivious to what had just happened. She stood again, taller now, her mind already shifting into the rhythm of preparation. Call in the babysitter, inform the neighbor, pack the bag that never fully unpacks. But there was still a moment of pause, a moment when she looked around at the scene she was leaving behind. Plates set for 3, crayons rolling across the floor, steam fogging the kitchen window. She breathed it in because she knew she might need to carry it with her, to hold it like a shield against the silence of barracks and the weight of the unknown. In another part of town, officers would scoff when they heard her name again, whisper doubts. "She's too young. She has kids. Why?" Her. They had always doubted. But here, in this kitchen, in the eyes of two children who had just seen their world shift, there was no doubt. There was only faith. And faith is heavier than any weapon. The phone buzzed again. Tom was short. She tied the apron strings loose, laid it across the back of the chair, and stepped into her boots. She didn't slam the door, didn't dramatize her leaving. She simply kissed each forehead, whispered one last time that she would return, and walked out into the night. The house grew quiet. The children held the tags in silence. And in the street outside, the world had no idea that Lieutenant Hawk had just been called back to duty. Part 1 ends here, with a spoon left in the pot, a dinner cooling on the stove, and a young woman stepping once more into the life she had chosen, a life that never really let her go. The house was quiet after she left, too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed into corners and made the walls feel thinner than they were. But she couldn't linger on it. Not when her boots were already carrying her across the pavement toward the waiting transport that would take her back to the base. The air was cool, laced with the smell of gasoline and cut grass. But in her chest there was a heaviness that had nothing to do with weather. She carried the memory of her son's furrowed brow, her daughter's trembling hands clutching the tags she had left with them, the unfinished dinner still steaming on the stove. She walked quickly but not hurried, her stride steady, because that was how Hawk always moved, measured, precise, and unflinching, no matter what weight she carried inside. When she stepped into the flood of fluorescent light at the base entrance, the world shifted instantly. Gone were the crayons and the hum of the kitchen. Here, the air buzzed with clipped orders and the metallic scrape of gear being shifted, the growl of engines coming to life. She tightened her grip on her bag and walked into it without hesitation. This was her other world, the one most people who judged her never saw. She had lived here before, she knew its rhythm. But she also knew how quickly whispers traveled in places like this, and she heard them already. Two young officers leaning by a mess tent, smirking. Guess they're getting desperate, calling her in. One muttered. She's got kids at home, doesn't she? Hope she remembers which end of the rifle is which. Their words weren't sharp, but they didn't have to be. Dismissal always stung more in its casualness. The assumption behind it, the arrogance of those who thought they already knew her limits. She didn't turn toward them, didn't flinch. Instead, she adjusted the strap on her rifle and kept walking. The truth always came out in the field, not in whispers. That was where Hawk answered. Briefings filled the night, maps spread wide across tables while the room buzzed with urgency, radio chatter echoing in the background. She stood in the back at first, quiet, listening while others crowded forward, voices overlapping as they argued about tactics, about timing, about terrain some of them had only ever seen in satellite images. Hawk didn't interrupt. She never had to. She absorbed it all, filing every detail into the sharp corners of her mind, the way she had since her earliest deployments. Silence was her weapon, not hesitation but focus, the kind that unnerved those who underestimated her. By the third briefing, her name was called, not by peers, but by the general leaning over the map, his finger stabbing at a red circle drawn across a valley. She's led this terrain before, he said plainly. She knows the choke points. She'll take point. The room went still for a breath, some faces flickering with irritation, others with surprise. But none argued. Orders were orders. She didn't smile, didn't nod triumphantly. She just stepped forward, because the truth wasn't in the declaration, it was in what came after. Still, she felt the weight of the earlier whispers resting against her ribs like stones. They thought she couldn't balance being Hawk and being Mom, that the two identities canceled each other out. They didn't understand. One didn't weaken the other. They strengthened each other. Her children weren't her weakness. They were her compass. Far away, in the quiet of her neighborhood, the neighbor tucked her kids into bed. The boy refused to let go of the tags, clutching them so tightly they left faint imprints in his palm. His sister whispered under the blanket, "She'll come back," with the certainty only children have, even when fear lingers heavy in their eyes. The neighbor didn't understand why the oven was cold, why crayons littered the floor, but she didn't ask. Some moments weren't for outsiders to name. In the dark, those children held on to silence the same way their mother did. Strong, steady, unbreakable. Back at the base, night deepened into something harder. The first convoy rolled out. Trucks lined in the glow of spotlights, soldiers climbing aboard with faces half-shadowed and tense. Hawk sat on her bunk for a final moment, her bag at her feet, rifle propped against the wall. Her hand slipped into her pocket where a folded piece of paper waited. Her daughter's drawing of a house, 2 children, and a tall figure labeled Mommy. She traced it with her finger. In the other pocket, her son's note whispered at her, "Don't forget us." As if she ever could. She folded them carefully, not as a soldier this time, but as a mother carrying the last echoes of home. Whispers shifted by morning, no longer mocking. They carried a different tone now. Curiosity, unease, the beginnings of respect. Some remembered rumors about her file, about that mission years ago where an ambushed convoy had been pinned down until Hawk led them out, carrying 2 soldiers herself when they collapsed, refusing to leave until the last man was safe. Most of the details were still redacted, buried in classified reports. But the ones who had been there never forgot. And neither had command. That was why her phone lit up last night. Why she'd been called from her kitchen table instead of someone else. By dawn she was airborne, the roar of engines swallowing the world as the transport cut across the sky. She sat strapped in, eyes closed not in rest, but in calculation. Every route, every checkpoint, every possibility unfolded in her mind like a map only she could read. Around her, younger officers shifted nervously, some still skeptical, some silent, but all watching. By the second night on foreign soil, their whispers had stopped entirely. They had seen the way she moved, steady in the dust, sharp under pressure, never missing a detail. They began to understand what the call sign meant. Hawk didn't miss. Hawk saw what others didn't. The mission was already buckling under pressure. Communications were spotty. A planned checkpoint had collapsed before they reached it, and an unmarked road turned treacherous under the tires. The younger ones faltered, muttering about bad intel, but she didn't waver. She adjusted quickly, her voice steady, cutting through the panic with calm precision. "We move here. Cover the flank. Watch the ridgeline." They followed, and when they saw the ambush that might have gutted them melt away because she had seen it coming before anyone else, their eyes shifted. Doubt turned into something quieter, heavier, trust. And through it all, she carried the weight of two small hands clutching her tacks. When exhaustion pressed into her shoulders, she remembered their faces. When fear edged into the silence between radio calls, she remembered the drawing tucked in her pocket. When uncertainty stretched ahead of her like a dark road with no end, she remembered her son's words. "Don't forget us." She hadn't. She never would. By the end of the week, dust coated her boots. Her uniform carried the weight of sleepless nights, and her eyes burned with the kind of vigilance that only comes from refusing to falter. But she hadn't faltered. Every step she took was balanced, precise, rooted in something far deeper than rank or recognition. She was Hawk, yes, but she was also Mom, and those two truths together made her something stronger than anyone in that barracks had expected. The ones who whispered now didn't mock. They watched in silence, learning something they couldn't have read in a manual. She crouched in the dust on a foreign road, radio pressed to her ear, eyes scanning the horizon as the sun bled into the edges of the sky. Behind her, younger soldiers shifted nervously, waiting for her call. Ahead of her, uncertainty stretched wide and dangerous. But inside her chest was the steady pulse of home, the memory of a warm kitchen, two small faces, the unfinished dinner left cooling on the stove. She wasn't just carrying a rifle. She was carrying them, and that made her unstoppable. The air was heavy with dust and the smell of diesel, the kind that clung to the back of the throat and reminded everyone how far from home they really were. But for Hawk, it was just another layer of silence she had learned to carry. The convoy had stalled at the edge of a narrow pass, mountains looming on either side like clenched fists, radios hissing with half-lost chatter. Younger soldiers shifted uneasily, glancing at each other, muttering about bad intel, and asking why command would put them here with no backup. Their nerves buzzed in the air, sharp and restless, but she stayed still, crouched low, eyes sweeping the ridgeline. She had seen this before. Not this exact valley, but the shape of it, the feeling of tension that pressed in like a warning. They didn't know what they were walking into, but she did. Hawk had always seen what others missed. That was why she carried the call sign in the first place. She motioned for silence, one hand raised, the other on the radio pressed against her ear. The chatter faded. Even the restless mutters stilled. Her presence had a gravity now, something that demanded quiet even from those who had mocked her days ago. Minutes passed like hours. The dust settled into the silence, heavy, expectant. And then it came, the faintest flicker of movement on the ridge, almost invisible in the fading light. A figure too still, too sharp against the rocks. She didn't hesitate. Eyes up, right side ridge, 2 o'clock. Her voice cut through the air, crisp, commanding. Soldiers snapped to follow her line of sight, weapons raised, the convoy tightening its defense. The trap was sprung seconds later, gunfire erupting from both sides, echoing off the rock walls, a storm of noise and light that swallowed the valley whole. But they weren't caught off guard. Not this time. They were ready, because Hawk had seen it coming. The firefight was brutal, sharp, the kind of chaos that swallowed time whole. Shouts, the crack of rifles, the heavy thud of mortar rounds shaking the ground beneath them. Younger soldiers panicked, some faltering, but Hawk was everywhere at once, her voice steady, her movements precise. Cover fire left flank. Move the wounded back. Keep the convoy tight. She wove through the storm like it was just another kitchen she knew how to command, steadying hands and steadying hearts. At one point, she pulled a soldier twice her size out from the path of a collapsing wall of rock, dragging him to cover without breaking stride. Doubt evaporated in that moment. They weren't following her because of orders anymore. They were following her because she had become the center of their survival. Hours bled into one another until the ridge fell silent again, smoke curling up into the sky, the valley littered with spent shells and the weight of survival. The convoy was battered but intact. They had lost less than anyone had feared, and more importantly, they had made it through. Soldiers sat in the dirt, gulping water, hands still trembling from the adrenaline. Hawk didn't sit. She walked the line, checking each face, each wound, each piece of gear, her own exhaustion hidden behind a calm steadiness. When she finally stopped, it was only to reach into her pocket and press her hand against the folded paper there, the drawing of the house, the note from her son. She didn't read them. She didn't need to. Just the feel of them was enough to steady the storm still roaring inside her chest. Later that night, back at base, the whispers began again, but they weren't mocking now. They were reverent, hushed, the kind of whispers people carried when they weren't sure if they were allowed to speak too loudly about what they had just seen. Stories spread quickly. How Hawk had spotted the ambush before anyone else. How she had pulled a man from the line of fire like it was nothing. How her voice had cut through chaos and steadied hands that would have otherwise faltered. Some added more, embellishing with awe, saying she never missed a detail, that her eyes seemed to see in every direction at once. The younger ones who had doubted her fell quiet when her name was spoken. Respect had replaced arrogance, and silence replaced ridicule. But the true reckoning came not in the whispers, but in the briefing room the next day. The general stood before the assembled unit, his gaze sharp, his voice carrying the weight of command. "What you saw out there," he said, his eyes sweeping the room before landing on her, "is why we call her Hawk. She doesn't miss. She never has. When others doubted, when others dismissed, she saw, and that vision saved you." The room stilled. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed of the doubts they had voiced. Others looked at her with something like awe. For the first time, the silence in that room was not disbelief. It was respect. She didn't stand taller. She didn't need to. Recognition was never why she had served. She thought instead of her children, of the tags clutched in small hands back home, of the dinner left cooling on the stove, of the crayons scattered on the floor. They didn't know this part of her world. They didn't see the firefights, the maps, the whispers turned to silence. But they didn't need to. They believed in her already, without proof, without reports, without medals. To them, she had never needed to be Hawk. She had only needed to be Mom. And somehow, carrying both had made her stronger. When the transport finally carried her back home weeks later, she stepped off not with a parade waiting, not with cameras flashing, but into the quiet street she had left behind. The porch lights were on, the curtains half drawn. She carried her bag over her shoulder, boots scuffing the familiar pavement, her stride once again measured and steady. The door opened before she reached it. Two children burst out, barefoot, their small hands clutching the tags they had kept close every night. They didn't wait for explanation. They didn't ask what happened. They just wrapped themselves around her, burying their faces in her uniform still dusted with the world she had just walked through. And in that moment, all the silence, all the whispers, all the weight she had carried broke and lifted, replaced by the only thing that mattered. She had left as a mother making dinner in her kitchen. She had returned as Hawk, the soldier who saw what others didn't. But she didn't need to choose between them. She never had. Because strength wasn't in being one or the other. It was in being both. And the world, finally, had seen what her children already knew.